America's entrance into World War II commenced with a devastating event that shocked the globe. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Japanese, with 129,400 soldiers and air support, began their invasion of the Philippine Islands. Within a month, the Japanese had captured the capital, Manila. What happened at the Battle of Bataan? How did over 100,000 American and Filipino soldiers and civilians become prisoners of war? What was the Bataan Death March, and what was the experience of the prisoners? Were any of them rescued? On December 8, 1941, Major General Jonathan M. Wainwright commanded the North Luzon Force, comprising 3 reserve Filipino divisions and the 26th Cavalry Regiment, also known as the Filipino Scouts. The main force of Lieutenant General Masahiro Homa's 14th Army landed at Lingayen Gulf on the morning of December 22nd. The Americans and Filipinos, outgunned, outnumbered, and without air support, could not hold the beaches at Lingayen Gulf. By the end of the day, the Japanese had secured most of their objectives and were advancing onto the Central Plain. Late on the afternoon of the 23rd, Wainwright called General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila and informed him that any further defense of the Lingayen beaches was impractical. He requested and was granted permission to withdraw behind the Agno River. Retreating from the Japanese, Allied forces withdrew onto the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor by January 1942, where they defended the entrance to Manila Bay. This forced the American and Filipino defenders of Luzon to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula for the next 3 months. The combined U.S.-Filipino Army held out despite a lack of naval and air support. In March, Wainwright was promoted to lieutenant general and was informed that reinforcements were coming and to hold on. This was a false promise from General Douglas MacArthur to give the men hope and keep them resisting to buy more time. Finally, on April 9th, out of ammunition and without resupply, and with his forces crippled by starvation and disease, U.S. General Edward King, Jr. surrendered with his approximately 75,000 troops. Ironically, MacArthur decided to abandon his own plan for a robust defense and evacuated President Emmanuel L. Quezon, High Commissioner Francis B. Sayre, their families, and his own headquarters to Corregidor. On the 24th, Brigadier General Richard J. Marshall remained behind in Manila as the Chief of Staff to close the headquarters and supervise shipping of supplies and the evacuation of the remaining troops. On December 26th, Manila was officially declared an open city, and MacArthur's proclamation was published in the newspapers and broadcast over the radio. The Battle of Bataan proper lasted from January 7, 1942, until April 9th, when Major General Edward King, Jr. surrendered his force to Colonel Motu Nakayama, a regimental commander in the 14th Army. On April 9, 1942, U.S. and local forces surrendered, stunning the Japanese. Lieutenant General Masahiro Homa inherited twice as many captives as his reports had estimated, creating an enormous logistical challenge. There was no way he could transport over 78,000 prisoners, of which 12,800 were American servicemen, along with the remaining starved, sick, and wounded prisoners and civilians, totaling 38,000, who also became prisoners. Colonel Nakayama wanted to move the prisoners and refugees to the north to get them out of the way of Homa's final assault on Corregidor, but there was simply not enough mechanized transport. As a result, the collective Filipino-American prisoners were soon rounded up by the Japanese. The men were divided into groups of approximately 100, and the march typically took each group around 5 days to complete. The prisoners started off from Mariveles on April 10th and Bagac on April 11th, converging in Pilar, Bataan, and heading north to the San Fernando railhead. Initially, there were instances of kindness by Japanese officers and soldiers who spoke English, such as sharing food and cigarettes and allowing personal possessions to be kept. However, the horrors they soon experienced were not unique to the prisoners of war captured on Bataan. Japanese atrocities against other Allied soldiers, such as the British and Australians, after the fall of places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and the invasions of Burma and Borneo, as well as New Guinea, were already well known. Japanese mass murders against Korean and Chinese civilians were also coming to light. Mass shootings, bayonettings, and beheadings were common. Despite the initial cordiality extended by the Japanese to the Americans and Filipinos, this congenial attitude rapidly changed. Their prisoners soon became victims of unrelenting brutality, theft, and even having their teeth knocked out for gold fillings. The Japanese had little respect for men who surrendered and did not fight to the death. The first atrocities are attributed to Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, when approximately 350 to 400 Filipino officers and NCOs were executed in what became known as the Pantingan River Massacre. Tsuji disobeyed General Homa's wishes that the prisoners be transferred peaceably. Tsuji had issued orders to his officers to execute all prisoners in their custody. Although some Japanese officers ignored the orders and refused to murder, others actively participated in the killing of POWs during the march. Prisoners received little food or water, and many died from disease and exhaustion. Those not immediately executed were subjected to severe physical abuse, including beatings and torture. On the march, the sun treatment was a common form of torture, where prisoners were forced to sit in the blazing sunlight without head coverings. Anyone who asked for water or broke formation to drink from standing pools of water was shot dead or beheaded. Trucks drove over some of those who fell behind or succumbed to fatigue. Those prisoners too weak to continue were murdered. Many were randomly stabbed, bayoneted, beaten, or beheaded. American Lieutenant Kermit Lay later recounted the brutality. They pulled us off into a rice paddy and began shaking us down. There were about 100 of us, so it took time to get to all of us. Everyone had their pockets turned out and laid all their things out in front. They were taking jewelry and doing a lot of slapping. I laid out my New Testament. After the shakedown, the Japs took an officer and 2 enlisted men behind a rice shack and shot them. The men who had been next to them said that they had Japanese souvenirs and money on them. The exact figures of the murdered are unknown. Estimates range from 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino deaths and 500 to 650 American deaths. During the march to the railway, once the surviving prisoners arrived in Balanga, the overcrowded conditions and poor hygiene caused dysentery and other diseases to spread rapidly. The Japanese did not provide the prisoners with medical care, so U.S. medical personnel tended to the sick and wounded as best they could with few or no supplies. Upon arrival at the San Fernando railhead, prisoners were stuffed into brutally hot metal boxcars for the 1-hour trip to Capas, but the outside temperature was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The boxcar temperatures became ovens. At least 100 prisoners were pushed into each of the unventilated boxcars, which had no sanitation facilities, and the dead mounted. When the train arrived at Capas train station, the survivors were forced to walk the final 9 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Even after arriving at Camp O'Donnell, the survivors of the march continued to die at rates of up to several hundred per day, which amounted to a death toll of as many as 20,000 prisoners. The total distance of the march from Mariveles to San Fernando and from Capas to Camp O'Donnell is about 65 miles. It is believed that thousands more troops died because of the brutality of their captors, who starved and beat the marchers and bayoneted those too weak to walk. Survivors were taken by rail from San Fernando to prisoner of war camps, where thousands more died from disease, mistreatment, and starvation. Most of the dead were buried in mass graves dug by the Japanese behind the barbed wire surrounding the compound. Of the estimated 78,000 POWs at the march, only 54,000 made it to Camp O'Donnell. 3 American officers managed to escape during the march, and eventually, in January 1944, news of the march and the unmitigated savagery meted out to the prisoners became public knowledge in America. It was not until January 27, 1944, that the U.S. government informed the American public about the march, when it released sworn statements of military officers who had escaped. Shortly thereafter, the stories of these officers were featured in a Life magazine article. The Bataan Death March and other Japanese actions incited intense hatred for Japan. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General George C. Marshall made the following statement: "These brutal reprisals upon helpless victims evidence the shallow advance from savagery which the Japanese people have made. We serve notice upon the Japanese military and political leaders, as well as the Japanese people, that the future of the Japanese race itself depends entirely and irrevocably upon their capacity to progress beyond their aboriginal barbaric instincts." Survivors of the Bataan Death March endured 3.5 years of death camps, brutal labor, and unimaginable indignities and injury. More than half the Americans taken prisoner on Bataan died before the war ended. This was greater than the overall death rate for American POWs in Japan, which was 40%. It was more deadly to be a POW than to be a combat Marine in the Pacific. Some of the POWs were eventually sent to labor camps in Japan aboard hell ships, which were grossly overcrowded and had no markings to indicate they were carrying prisoners. As a result, they were targeted and destroyed by U.S. Navy submarines and aircraft. After the war, a number of officers and soldiers from the 14th Army, including Masaharu Homa, were tried for war crimes. Homa was convicted on February 11, 1946, by a U.S. military commission in Manila and executed on April 3rd. Colonel Tsuji never faced punishment. He had fled Japan and lived in Thailand, Vietnam, and China after the war until he was granted amnesty in 1950. In 1952, he won a seat in the Japanese parliament. In 1942, when news of the Bataan Death March was released, the American public reacted with shock and fury. The episode galvanized the war effort and added to the resolve of Allied forces fighting in the Pacific theater. The survivors of the march are remembered for their incredible courage and endurance in the face of unspeakable hardship and brutality. Their experiences remain a solemn chapter in the history of World War II, and their sacrifice is commemorated in memorials and remembrances to this day. If you found this story insightful, please subscribe to the History Intrigue channel for more compelling narratives from the past. We invite you to share your thoughts and comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing history to life.